What's up, guys? Let's do some more SQL. So the question we have today is number of calls between two persons. And here we have a calls table. And this table doesn't have a primary key. It may contain duplicates. And so this contains the duration of a phone call from one ID to another ID. And for each row, we can assume that no one is just calling themselves. So we need to write a solution to report the number of calls and the total call duration between each pair of distinct persons. So we have person 1 and 2, where person 1 is less than person 2, and this can be in any order. So if we look at this example here, this would be considered uh, a pair, right? 1 and 2, and then 2 and 1. These should both be counted as one value, right? So 1 and 2, and 1 and 2 again, if you flip the 1 and the 2 in this row. And then we should be able to add up the duration, right? So as you can see here, 1 and 2, we don't have a 2 and 1 row, right? So basically, if we go through every single row and we put the smallest ID on the left and the largest ID on the right, then you would get 1, 2, and 3 and 4, right? So that would make this one combination, this one combination, and then this another combination, right? So that means we should get something like 70 for this, 20, and then this would be, if you add all these up, 400, 500, 999, right? Which is what we're getting here. And here we have 4 calls, 4 different calls here, 1 call here, and 2 calls here, which is what we have here. Right? So I think this makes sense intuitively. Let's talk about how we could go about doing this. So we could obviously do a case statement, right? We could have a case statement. So if the calls dot from ID is less than our to ID, then we'll keep our from ID. Otherwise, we'll do our to ID. So that means we have a case statement for our first 2 columns, right? That'll check what the smallest ID is. And then we can do our call count. We'll use like an aggregation function, right? We'll group it by person 1, person 2, and then we'll count. We'll do like a count number of rows, so count star, and then we can do a sum for our total duration, so we can do duration here, and obviously we'll do our case statement for our first 2 columns. And also I'll show you a nice little function if you don't want to do a case statement. So let's just get into coding so we can explain this better. So here's our editor, and let's go ahead and do our case statement, right? So we can do say when calls dot from ID is less than calls dot to ID, then we'll take our from ID since this one's smaller. Otherwise, we'll take our to ID since that one is smaller. And then we will call this person 1, right? Person 1. And then we'll do something very similar for the second column. So if 2id is greater, then we'll do 2id. So this column will always have the greater ID in there. Call this person 2. And then we'll do count star. So we're counting the number of rows where we have a 1 and a 2. So let's look here just to explain this better. So in this case, we're building a new table. So it looks like this, right? All the smallest values are on the left and the largest values are on the right. So we're basically going through and we're counting. We're going to group it, obviously, but we're going to count every row that has a 1 and a 2 in this order, right? So then we can just count how many rows do we have. That's why we have the count star. So in this case, we have 2. In this case, we have 1. In this case, we have 4, right? So let's go back to our editor. So count star as call count. And then we'll do a sum calls dot duration. So obviously our group by is very important here. I'm pretty sure it'll throw an error if we don't group it. So we'll say from calls, and we'll do our group by person 1, person 2. So this should look good. Cool. So let's run this. Awesome. So this worked, right? Now let's do a little bit of a simpler way of doing this. We don't have to use a case statement, and let's just copy this, comment it out, and instead of doing a case statement, we can use a function called least, right? So we can do least. This is a Postgres function. We can say calls dot from ID, calls dot to ID, so it'll take the least, the smallest value in the parameters. Then we can do, there's another function called greatest, and it'll just take the greatest value. So, and we're still ordering or grouping it by the same values, so we'll do this again. So this is a bit cleaner. You don't want to do a case statement. And this also works. So hopefully you learned something. Thanks for watching.